Most of us have grown up with fairy tales of sorts, fantasies from storybooks to stimulate young imaginations, and perhaps some old ones too. I've been so fortunate to uncover a real-life fairy tale that has actually spanned generations. And it was right there beside me for so many years, hidden in the past life and family story of my dear friend Chi. A past that she left behind when she escaped communist Vietnam and started her new life in capitalist Norway as a 12-year-old little girl. A past that I had no knowledge of in the first few decades of our friendship, since our time together was always very much focused on the here and now and not at all on our pasts. And I actually can't remember exactly how the layers of her family history started unraveling, but with every layer, I understood that her family story was fascinating, deep and complex, as life tends to be, of course. Chi's just happens to involve imperial court as well as peasant farms, an idealistic and altruistic doctor, and a disillusioned vice president of Vietnam. A journey of life and death trying to escape the very regime that her grandfather had been representing. And in between, some of the most dramatic stories of life and love, each worthy of its own film script, in my mind at least. And as I learned more, I decided that Chi's story really should be documented for the sake of her children and future generations. So in an ambitious moment a few years ago, I put pen to paper and started writing. So if you're watching now, it's excerpts of this that you're about to hear. Now, many of you watching know or know of Alistair Miller's work, Viking's photographer. He's a great friend and hosts Tuesdays in Conversation with on Viking.TV. Alistair was on board the Viking Sun in his role photographing our new destinations on the world cruise and had his wife, my friend Chi, along as his lighting assistant. And yes, I did just give away the happy ending of this fairy tale, but you'll learn more about that later. Guests on board caught wind of the fact that Chi had an interesting story and that I was writing a bit about it. So when I came on board in Hong Kong for what was to be a very personal journey for Chi and I on that particular leg of the world cruise, sailing through the South China Seas, where she'd been rescued from an otherwise certain death. She was actually rescued by a Norwegian LNG tanker. The story became one that we were requested to share with guests. So to a full Star Theatre, very impromptu, we did a little reading, and it seemed to have moved some people, at least, as we had a standing ovation at the end, which of course was very flattering and very inspiring. I should get the book finished. It still isn't, but it will be. So my warning to you is this: the story was not intended to be shared as it is. And I'm neither a professional writer nor an orator, but Chi's story stands on its own as by far the most fascinating life story of anyone that I've ever had the privilege of knowing. So if you choose to spend the next hour listening, I hope you get a flavor and I hope that you enjoy. We're also sharing some pictures from a very intimate wedding that we had for Chi and Alistair in Venice a few years ago, where the very captain who rescued her 3 decades prior, plucked her from the South China Seas, showed up from Norway, unbeknownst to Chi, who hadn't seen him since her rescue, and gave her away, in the very same uniform that he wore the day that she was given new life. It was a small gathering, but a very Viking family-spirited gathering, as almost all of us present work for Viking in some way. And since more than ever this year, we feel very virtually connected to everyone, we thought we might share this Viking family album for those of you interested. So that's enough of my introduction. It's over to the reading, and we very much hope that you enjoy. Oh, and by the way, Chi is sitting on stage rather quietly, not saying a word. That's because she made me promise that she didn't have to say anything. She's rather publicly shy, though the words that I'm reading are entirely her story, of course. Enjoy.
Good afternoon, fellow Viking travelers, ladies and gentlemen. Today is a special thing that's going to happen on the stage here today, and between 1975 and 1991, about 6,500 Vietnamese refugees were rescued by about 150 Norwegian ships. Today we have one story from one of these rescues. 36 years ago, a Norwegian LNG ship, the Hög Gandria, stopped to rescue a small boat and saved 70 Vietnamese refugees on board from an almost certain death. As you can see from the map, the rescue took place at north 8 degrees 15 minutes and east 109 degrees and 6 minutes, far away from land. And tonight we will be sailing near this location. I was lucky enough and honored enough to meet the captain or the master of this ship last year on the shakedown cruise of the Viking Sky. One of the refugees rescued that day was a 12-year-old girl who subsequently immigrated to Norway and became best of friends with Karine Hagen. Many of you have met the same girl and know her on the Viking Sun as a dear friend, Chi, whose family and personal stories is quite remarkable. Karine and Chi have agreed to share some of these stories with you, as they are very relevant to where we are now and the country we will be visiting the next couple of days. So Karine and Chi, welcome to the stage.
Before I start reading, I'd just like to say that this is rather unrehearsed and unprepared, but therefore it's also quite real. I have been documenting the story of my best friend for a couple of years. I've had a lot of other things to do as well, and my main mission in life, for all kinds of reasons, is to finish this book. It isn't quite finished, and this is rather daring, but I know some of our friends here on board have asked if we could share some of Chi's amazing stories, and that's what we'll do. So I'll read a bit from the book. The story is amazing, and it starts with her great-grandmother, and I'll read sort of different generations of her family's life, culminating in with Chi and her rescue. And if I may, the captain mentioned the longitude latitude, and we're not far from it right now. And this here is not far from where we are and where Chi was given second life in 1982. So I'll read bits and pieces of the book as it is so far, and it is Chi and her family's life. For now, it's called Firefly Lanterns, and hopefully you'll understand soon why it's called Firefly Lanterns. I think that it'll probably take about, I think I've got 20 pages I'm going to read, and it'll probably take a good half hour. So, Firefly Lanterns, the power of light. The original escape. "If you don't leave now, there'll be no tomorrow," the guard tongue whispered to my great-grandmother. As silent as a butterfly, she slipped her favorite ink nib and the pearl of Hue into her Audai pocket, and with no other belongings followed her faithful subject out the back doors of the palace. Under the cover of night, armed only with a small oil lamp, they started running for their lives. Tan set their direction to Vindlong, the village he'd grown up in, and a place he thought great-grandmother would have the best chance of hiding and surviving. When they reached a safe distance, they stopped for a minute's rest, and great-grandmother turned around, facing east, to take a silent last look at the twinkling lights of her childhood home. She knew she would never see it again, and that life from now on would be very different. And so, as the 1800s came to a close, began my great-grandmother's new life, from privileged princess of imperial Indochina to peasant girl in the Mekong Delta, not knowing then that a century later, under a very different set of circumstances, I, her great-granddaughter, would be on a very similar journey of escape to the other side of the world. Obviously, I'm writing this first person as if I'm Chi. So that's sort of her great-grandmother. And a little bit more about great-grandmother, just to give you some context. Great-grandmother was part of the Nguyen ruling dynasty established by Emperor Nguyen An in 1802. Can you hear me still? Yeah. Who unified the country and named it Vietnam for the first time. Life at imperial court, though privileged, had been isolating for my great-grandmother. She lost her mother at a young age, had no siblings, and was a very lonely child. She always wanted the freedom to be like ordinary people, to be able to go to the local market and see the vibrant natural colors of the abundance provided by our earth, to smell the sweet floral and citrusy scents of the local markets, to buy sticky rice in banana leaf and eat without ceremony, to listen to the hustle and bustle of daily life and chatter, continually interrupted by chickens cackling and bicycle bells ringing. But her reality was different. Her reality was pomp and circumstance, etiquette and education. Formality ruled, and a child was to be seen and not heard. The servants at the palace and her beloved tutors were her only exposure to the outside world, and it was through books and staff that she learned and lived. And so it was to her studies she fled to fulfill her empty existence. Sorry, I'm going to be flipping a little bit here. When great-grandmother had to flee Hue in the end of the 1800s, she had no family left alive. She was alone and felt a great need to be taken care of. Though she was not in love with Tan, her god, she trusted him. He'd saved her life, he knew her past, which he would not divulge to a soul, and she knew he would not betray her. And so they married, with Tan determined to provide well for their fast-growing family. Despite his poor background and illiteracy, he would get there by sheer hard work. Transitioning to peasant lifestyle was not easy, but great-grandmother was eternally grateful for being alive and was determined to make the most of the life that she had been so fortunate as to keep. She had learned early that everything can be taken away from you, your home, your belongings, your family, but one thing that remains with you, whatever your circumstances, is your mind, and that with a good education, anything is achievable. She was not happy being a farmer's wife, but was resigned to her reality. There was a shortage of just about everything material, but education continued to be at the core of my great-grandmother's universe, and something she was going to make sure every one of her 8 children would have as much of as she could give them. When Tang said very basic writing and reading skills were enough for their sons, who he meant should remain peasants and work the rice fields for the rest of their lives, she vehemently disagreed. She was determined to give their children education and a better future despite their limited means. She used the term ladder to success instead of the word education, and was unshakable in her determination to put her children on that ladder. Daylight hours are precious if you live off the land, and peasant children did not go to school, but were expected to work the fields with their parents while the sun was out. Nights come early and fast. Twilight barely exists close to the equator, and dark is very dark in rural Vietnam. There was no electricity in the village, and lamp oil was expensive and used only on special occasions by the poor. So when the sun switched off, the artificial lights did not come on. Though great-grandmother and Tan did own an oil lamp, the one used on the night they fled Hue, it was never used and had the most honored location in the house. It was considered a critical part of saving their lives and had never been lit since. After sunset was the only time the children would possibly have left for lessons, but with no inside light after darkness, great-grandmother had to improvise. With necessity as the mother of invention, she harvested the light that nature itself produced at night. Carefully, she emptied several chicken eggs, filled them with live fireflies that glowed in the dark, and hung them on strings from the ceiling in the kitchen corner. The light generated by these Firefly Lanterns was enough for the children to do their lessons at night. In daylight, the kitchen corner was an uninspiring yet functional place, but night after night, it came alive, a glowing den of knowledge that would serve as a home school for all of their 8 surviving children, because she had 13, didn't she? Yeah. My great-grandparents started their married life very poor, but by the end of their lives, they'd managed to build substantial land holdings. By the time they'd passed away, they'd given all their children roots and wings in the form of land and education. Under the glow of Firefly Lanterns, all 8 surviving children were given a homeschooling and a platform to go on to very successful careers, including several engineers, a lawyer, a high court judge, and my grandfather, a doctor, who became the vice president of Vietnam. So we'll talk a little bit about grandfather. Being too poor to attend school, my grandfather and his siblings helped their father in the rice fields, raking and gathering cut grass into piles or building dikes and dams for the farmland. At home, they shared the house chores, husking rice and pounding the rice into flour. Being the oldest boy, grandfather was always in charge of carrying rice baskets on his bare head, and on his bare head would bring the harvest to merchants at the market. He was honest as the day was long and brought all the money back to his mother without a single coin missing ever. Showing signs of excellence at almost everything from an early age, great-grandmother saw his potential and decided to give her son extra attention, as well as be extra demanding on him. Despite being tired after long days of manual labor, at night, under great-grandmother's homemade Firefly Lanterns, grandfather and the rest of the children were homeschooled. Grandfather loved feeling knowledgeable, and the more he learned, the more he wanted to learn, much like the rest of us, I suppose. On the rare day he was allowed off working the fields, he would go to the closest school and stand outside the classroom window to listen to the lessons, often with a younger sibling strapped on his back. Though poor, they were never hungry, as they had access to rice all the time. They also had access to all that the rice fields provided, including mudfish, which is a type of catfish, and eels. The fish would be placed in large pots in layers with salt and left to ferment for over a month to create marm, fermented fish used as condiment in various dishes, baking aubergines or mixing with eggs and rice, etc. There was not a lot of meat, so grandfather's favorite food, tit ko tau, pork meat in fat marinated with coconut milk and fish sauce, was something he would wish for on special occasions and every New Year's Eve. Later in life, when he could afford himself anything, he would only eat this dish and have to have it every single day. Right. My grandfather was short on money, but long on potential. Perhaps I should point him out. He's the dashing fellow in the bow tie on the left-hand side of the screen. So he was short on money but long on potential, and this was apparent to all who met him. He had full scholarships to university and full sponsorship to a number of soccer teams. He had a brilliant brain, a strong body, and endless charm. When he'd earned the prestige of entering medical school, this picture was taken at medical school, right, in Saigon? In Hanoi, yeah. When he'd earned the prestige of entering medical school, my grandmother took the courage to approach one of the wealthiest families in Sardek to ask for the hand of the daughter for her son. The intention was to ask for the hand of the older sister, but since my grandfather was with her when they entered the home of this wealthy family, he fell for the younger sister immediately. The father accepted and they were engaged. My grandmother didn't mind. She was betrothed to a handsome, intelligent man who she assumed correctly was also kind. With my grandmother, he conquered the heart of not only a clever and proper girl, but married into a wealthy family. His wedding gift to his bride was his treasured pearl of Hue, the only heirloom to have made it out of the imperial city. Grandmother wore this with pride when they attended special events, and actually she is wearing it tonight. She's given it to me for safekeeping, so I get to wear it also sometimes, but she's wearing it tonight. And it's beautiful. Have a look afterwards if you can, will you? So, let's see, skip a little forward. So a little bit about grandfather and his career, just a little bit. There's a lot in this that we've written, but we're obviously just selecting some short segments. The communists were very clever in using important southerners in seemingly important positions. When unification happened in 1975, it was strategically important for the government to appear to have an educated and popular South Vietnamese as president. My school friend Chao's grandfather, Nguyen Hu To, had been a successful and respected lawyer and was an obvious appointee for the role, while real power lay with the General Secretary of the Communist Party. This was similar to the French, who kept the emperors to placate the people, while real power then lay with the French. They also wanted a popular, educated Southern Vietnamese to be the vice president. My grandfather had been a successful doctor with respect from all levels of Vietnamese society, building a fortune on servicing the wealthy and giving away his fortune by helping the poor. A Vietnamese Robin Hood. Having grown up poor himself, he would offer his services for free to those who could not afford medical service. And so in demand was he that the queues would go out the clinic and around several blocks. My grandfather was a great patriot and believed that Vietnam belonged to the Vietnamese, not to the Chinese, who'd been dominant there for 1,000 years, and not to the French, who'd been dominant there for 100 years, and not for the Americans, who'd been a 10-year threat. When offered the position of Vice President of Unified Vietnam in 1975, my grandfather was honored and full of hope that communism was the closest ideology to a sovereign Vietnam. It did not take long for that honor to turn to shame and the hope to turn to disillusion. He moved into a grand home in District 3. I remember it well, as it became my childhood home. In the beginning of his tenure in leading, in quotes, the country, he had been offered many benefits, including dozens of guards at his disposal and 3 cars, 2 black Mercedes and 1 white French Citroën. After a while, he returned 1 Mercedes and several guards. He kept the other Mercedes only so that I could be transported in it to school, while he himself bicycled around everywhere and didn't want to have a guard in tow. Sometimes he drove the Citroën himself with me sitting next to him. Those were the cozy drives. After a while, he also returned the last Mercedes and kept only 2 guards and the Citroën. For me, it was actually more fun to ride in the Citroën. He knew how poor the country was, and he hoped his frugality and refusal of privilege could set an example. I remember how he, day after day, buried himself in sorrow at the direction that the communists were taking the country. He realized that he and Chao's grandfather, the president, were really puppet vice president and president for the communists, who did exactly what they wanted without listening to them. The Vietnamese communists copied China and Mao's destruction of anything intellectual in the beginning, including massive book-burning pogroms. They had an expansive campaign taking properties from wealthy families and called it the Revolution Against Capitalism. They occupied other people's homes and sent the landowners to Kin Te Moi, new economic areas in the forests. People who were clever and productive were not allowed to use their skills, but convinced to be peasants. It was just like during Mao's time, determined to make everyone equally poor. Grandfather continued to decline benefits and was less and less politically active. He was very disappointed in how his country had turned out under the communists. They were really peasants, he thought, with little education and therefore little idea of how to strengthen a country after a long, hard war. Grandfather observed these developments with pain. He had too much Confucianism in his veins, something he had been given by his mother. "This is not what I want for my Vietnam," I often heard him say. Okay, so let's see. And we'll move on to, I think your mother comes next. So then we'll talk a little bit about my mother, Chi's mother. My mother was a rebel. Doesn't look really like a rebel there, but there's a lot that I can't read in public about your mummy. So I'm just reading the other bits. My mother was a rebel. She was the favorite child of both grandfather and grandmother, and as the youngest daughter with 2 older brothers, she was very spoiled. She was born in 1945 with a silver spoon in her mouth. Her father was one of Vietnam's first doctors, and her mother came from a very wealthy family. The first 15 years of her life, she lived in luxury and did all she wanted to do without considering any others. She studied at Beijing University to become a rocket launch expert and was on numerous occasions honored by being invited into the Communist Party, but every time thanked them with a determined decline. Her favorite story from her student days in Beijing is one of showing disdain for the communists. Every week, students had to gather to report to their student leaders, and all North Vietnamese students used to praise and thank the communists for their comforts, for having a warm duvet, a good jacket, or enough food. Some even cried in their thank you speeches to the party. My mother, on the other hand, couldn't avoid laughing out loud every time to show her disdain. She was never reprimanded, but always remembered for being the callous one. Mother had not wanted to marry the man who became my father. She'd been in love with a party comrade of my grandfather, a much older man, which created a political scandal in Hanoi. Her lover was a very prominent politician of high political rank in the north. And this was considered a very improper relationship, both because of the age differences and his political relationship to my grandfather. The timing was also particularly bad, as this was the year grandfather was going to meet Ho Chi Minh, and the party did not want any scandals to overshadow this important meeting. So the communists put an end to the affair and selected three good young comrade candidates for her to choose as husband, none of which she was the remotest bit interested in. She says she chose my father because she said his body looked like that of a Roman sculpture, and for no other reason. My uncle always used to joke and claim that the real reason my mother fell for my father was because of the water boiler he had with him from his student times in Russia. She says she was never in love with my father, and her marriage was short and loveless, a union of two people from very different backgrounds who did not belong together at all. Her first big love was always the older man. Her second big love was my brother, Lam Gok Dong, who was 2 years younger than me and the apple of my mother's eye. She doted on him like he was the only person she cared for in the world. Ja, det tror jag ligger bak. Men ja, etterpå kanske. So she doted on him like he was the only person she cared for in the world. This was Chi's brother. When he died at the age of 4, she accused me of his death. Since that day, she decided to disobey every rule in the book. It was very difficult to get a divorce in Vietnam after 1975. Everything had to be approved by the Communist Party. Mother stood in court straight-backed and answered why she wanted to divorce my father. Because he's a true communist and a true peasant who would never suit me, who's a true upper-class girl. I would never have married him if you, the Communist Party, had not forced me to. I was then young and naive. Grandfather's younger brother was a high court judge and told this story in a family gathering. Grandfather shook his head in exasperation and her brothers burst out laughing. She did manage in the end to force her high court judge uncle to sign an approval for divorce. At the same time as being impossibly stubborn, she was charming and very popular. She created laughter and a good ambiance and was always at the center of any gathering. She was probably the most intelligent of the siblings and had an extraordinary talent for business. She would have been very successful if she'd chosen a traditional life and career, but instead she loved to leverage her high adrenaline. Her favorite motto was, "Better to be a fiery flame which ignites fast and extinguishes fast, than a dim oil lamp which glows steady and slow." After my parents' divorce and my brother's death, my mother's personality changed dramatically, both internally and externally. Her look went from being very natural with no makeup to being covered in it, from straight to curly hair, from always being home after 5 every day to almost never being home. Her prime motivation was to make money, however she possibly could, and she had no hesitations using her position as the daughter of the vice president to further her projects. She was a smuggler, a madam, an arms dealer, a black marketeer, you name it, she did it. And I don't think we're going to go any further. Now I think we'll come to Chi and a little about your childhood. All my childhood, I was curious to meet my paternal grandparents. And finally, when I was 6 years old, my mother agreed to let my father take my brother and I to meet this family we did not know. First, I thought it would be only me, since my brother was always sick with colds. They lived in a remote village in the south of Ca Mau, the end of Vietnam, it was referred to, and it was a 2-day journey by bus. My father had taken the last rows of the bus so we could lie down and rest. Today it takes about 10 hours by car to get to their village. In those days, probably quite a bit longer. Father, brother, and I drove on a bus, then a ferry, and overnighted in Can Tho, where my father used to teach. From there, my father sent me onwards alone with someone by car to Ca Mau, and after that on a rowboat through the canals. I wondered why my father kept my brother with him and sent me on alone, but just put it down to the fact that both my parents always favoritized my little brother because he was youngest and quite weak, and a boy, which is important for most Asians. Can Tho was the last place I saw my brother alive. I stayed with my grandparents about a week in their simple house with banana leaf roof and earth floors. It was really a straw hut with no electricity, and the water they had was rainwater collected in wells. One night I couldn't sleep at all. I didn't understand why I was so sleepless, my life's first of many sleepless nights. I finally fell asleep when the cock started crowing around 5 a.m. I'd not been asleep but for an hour when I heard a lot of commotion. I ran from grandmother's bedroom into the living room and saw my father had arrived. He had his head bowed and my brother wrapped in his favorite blanket lying on the simple sofa, with a strange coloring in his face. I remember thinking my brother is sick again. Surrounded by crying people, I slowly realized he wasn't sick, but he was dead. He had fallen ill in Can Tho, which is why my father stayed behind with him there. He'd had a fever for many days. In hospital, my brother had not wanted to lie in the bed, and so my father had to carry him around all the time. He got so tired that he fell asleep with my brother in his arms, and while he was asleep, the nurse gave my brother intravenous saline solution. He went into some form of shock and died right there in my father's arms. My father sobbed when he was telling us this, that because of his lack of attention, his son had died. I remember they said they were going to bury him in the back of the garden, and I was saying they mustn't do that until Mummy comes. But they did anyway. My grandparents, uncles, aunts all went to bury him. I remember it was at dusk. I was crying. I've had a guilty conscience all my life about the feeling I had at this moment in time. Although I was sad and shed tears for the loss of my darling little brother, I was also a bit happy he was gone, because I always felt I had never had any attention, and in a way I was quite jealous of him. There was a glimmer of joy as I thought I might now have more of my parents' attention. The proof of that was to me almost immediate. As my father told me to put my sandals on, it was the first time I felt my father said anything exclusively dedicated or directed to me. Put your sandals on. I ran, smiling, to my room to get my sandals. Finally, some attention to me that I had so dearly missed from both my mother and my father. That's how starved I had felt for attention. My mother arrived late at night. We'd finished my brother's funeral and everyone had gone to bed. My mother arrived with her typical entourage of various women and men. She never went anywhere without this entourage, it seemed. This time there were almost 20 people. I had no idea who they were. My mother was in floods of tears, and we brought her to my brother's grave. It was the first time I'd seen my mother cry in my whole life, perhaps the last time as well. My son, why did you die from me? I don't want to live any longer. She carried on like this for a long time. I don't want to live any longer. I was very scared, thinking if she doesn't want to live, what happens to me? And why would she want to die from me? For a 5-year-old, this was a crisis. I was beside myself with fear. People were supporting her, holding her up as she walked, so she didn't collapse under the weight of her grief. She had to cross a little canal by my grandparents' house. We called it Monkey Bridge. It was made of bamboo, which you would have to hold on to, and I found it difficult to cross. And my mother continued, I cannot continue to live without my son, my son, my son. I'm going to jump into the canal, and I will die together with you. I was terrified on many fronts. First, because my mother was so devastated, and second, because she might really throw herself into that canal and die from me, even though she was a very good swimmer. I was always warned about falling off that bridge into the canal. But at that moment, I remember I took the dangerous side to protect my mother from jumping in. She would have had to jump over me first. The next day, I found my mother, and we returned to Saigon. When we arrived, I recall grandfather held me very close. my head on his tummy as he patted my head and cried. And my mother looked at me with hateful eyes and said, "It was you who killed your little brother." I would never forget that. And it's probably the reason that all my life I have sought declarations of love, because I never really had it. Even the little bit of motherly love I thought she'd reserved for me was lost, and I was sent to live with my grandfather alone while she started her wild life of drugs, smuggling, stealing, and prostitution. And what I guess wasn't clear, because I've skipped obviously many parts, but she accused Chi of the death of her brother because it was Chi who wanted to meet the grandparents. So then we skip forward, and from then on, she lived with her grandfather very happily in the house in District 3. The house in District 3, grandfather had moved into when he became vice president, had a large wrought iron. This is not her mummy, by the way. This is her teacher, Hong. The house in District 3, grandfather had moved into when he became vice president, had a large wrought iron fence surrounding it and a front paved courtyard with colourful flower beds along the inside wall, in contrast to the dull communist outside world. On your way to the servants' quarters behind the main house, you had to pass under a large mango tree that overhung my bedroom balcony. I was always petrified of the very green, very poisonous snake in that mango tree, so grandfather often let me sleep in his bedroom. In there were 2 queen-sized beds with a bedside table and a radio on it. Always hungry for information and news, grandfather would constantly tune in BBC. I remember the joy in his face when he found it, crackled and almost indistinguishable, but a live link to the outside world. As a child, and until I was almost a teenager, I neither knew how to feed myself nor tie my shoelace, as our staff would have these as part of their duties. I was always driven to school by our chauffeur and escorted by my bodyguards. One day I decided not to leave school through the front entrance where my guards and chauffeur usually waited for me, but snuck out the back way and followed 2 girlfriends who lived not far from me. I just wanted to walk the streets like everyone else. Sounds a bit like your great-grandmother. But I had not thought of the challenge of crossing a street. In today's Ho Chi Minh City, which some of us will see tomorrow, there are mopeds everywhere, and any visitor must feel as daunted to cross the street as I did that day in Saigon. Although there were only bicycles then, there were thousands of them, and I was numb with fear and started crying. That was the moment I realized I was living in an unreal world. Though not as real a life as my classmates were living, mine was far more cultured. When the communists came to power, non-communist literature had to be burned. This was one policy my grandfather was very much against. And as this spread through word of mouth in Saigon, grandfather was strictly against the book burning policy. He loved books. And people who wanted to keep their book collections would somewhat ironically bring them to my grandfather, the vice president, who ensured they would not be burned. My grandfather wanted to instill in me all the knowledge great-grandmother had given him, and add to it a heavy dose of arts and literature. I was able to read when I was 5 years old, and by the time I was 7, grandfather's library was filled with books to satiate his appetite for knowledge instilled in him by great-grandmother, and with time an entire room next door filled fast with books he was safeguarding for the people. For me, this was an open door to paradise. I was always in those rooms. I dove into as many books as I possibly could. I had a brilliant memory then, not anymore, and could read a book of over 500 pages in a few days, and then tell grandmother or the housekeeper all the details in the book. In addition to the books, grandfather was passionate about opera and listened to it day and night. He used 2 types of devices, a regular cassette recorder, which he allowed me to operate, and one that played rolls of tape onto another empty roll. Opera takes time to appreciate, and I had no patience for a long time. But the more I let go of trying to understand, but just feel the music, the more I enjoyed it. And on the weekends, these operas would literally come alive, as grandfather took me to performances of folk opera, as we called it, Chinese opera in the Vietnamese language. But it was really when I discovered Western opera, where the singers had truly white, not powdered white faces, like in Chinese opera, and the music so different from ours that I properly fell in love with this great art form. My grandfather's favourites were Romeo and Juliet, Aida, and Madame Butterfly, which also became my favourites after he explained their stories. Grandfather would fall asleep in his armchair listening, and as I thought he was sleeping, I stood in front of the large mirror and dramatically played out the different roles. Later did I realize he was often only pretending to be asleep and was actually bemusedly watching my hopeless attempts of both acting and singing. Our routine was safe, civilized, and very cultured for a young child of that time. See, 1 second, and we'll fast forward a little bit. And this is just to give you all a little bit of context of Chi's family and life. I think there are a few pages we're fast forwarding to next. In 1977, 2 years into my grandfather's tenure as vice president, he was clearly disappointed with what his government represented, so he claimed ill health and retired. You can actually see that he's a disillusioned man. They gave him a series of honorary positions after the South was totally liberated in 1977, including Presidium Member, this is a long one, including Presidium Member, Vietnam's Committee for the Protection of World Peace, and member of Ho Chi Minh City's Committee for the Protection of World Peace, both symbolic gestures such that the nation not understand that he was abandoning the party. The next year, 1978, we started our series of attempted escapes as boat refugees from a regime my beloved grandfather had fought so hard to put in place and became so disillusioned by. So clear was he that he did not want us to spend the rest of our lives in Vietnam, that, albeit free of colonizers, was imploding on itself, that he was the one who encouraged us to flee. Our attempts at escape started in 1978, and 7 attempts later, in 1982, we were rescued. With grandfather's role as political leader, we always fled under a false name, and always were dressed as poorly as possible to not bring attention to ourselves. For a while, Vietnam had an agreement with China, where Chinese Vietnamese were allowed exit visas to China. It was under this agreement we tried to legally escape the first 3 times, right? Until the agreement lapsed and there was no more legal exit visas. Our 4th and 5th attempts were aborted. We got to the sea, but they were aborted, and I don't need to go into details on that, but we'll go to the 6th and the 7th attempt. So, 6th time was a few years later in 1981, and I was with my mother. We'd stayed in the village 3 days with a nice family with 2 boys, Lam and Bao, 7 and 5 years old. And in the evening, we had the message to get on the boat. We were hiding all night in the rice fields, 90 people lying closely together, hidden so no one could see us. I can't quite explain the smell of the people on the run. Our stench was describable only if you combined every type of human body odor you could imagine, and then add the smell of fear and adrenaline. This time, my mother was with us. She was with her mother. I remember very well I had with me a 2-liter can of water because we always had to have fresh water with us on the boat. And she had lemon slices sweetened with sugar. We finally ran to the boat at 5 o'clock in the morning. We had to climb up the side of the little fishing boat. It was dark and very slippery. And we had to climb up backwards. Once on board and the sun was starting to rise, everyone thought it strange we had to wait so long to leave. Then the boat started sailing. I think it was maximum 30 minutes we were at sea. You're on the river though, not at sea, right? You're on river here. It was pitch black, and then we heard ka-ka-ka-ka-ka. I don't know what it was. I didn't know what it was, but I thought it was something wrong with the engine. Suddenly I heard the boys sitting around me. There were 3 rows. I was sitting on the upper row, not lying down. My mother on the lower row, and Lam and a 13-year-old boy who was taller than me sat on either side of me. Suddenly I heard the 13-year-old shout out, "I've been shot in the arm." And then everything went wrong. Everybody was shouting and screaming, "Lam, Lam, where are you?" I heard his mother shout, "Lam, Lam, where are you? Where's my son? Where's my son?" Next thing I know, my mother is pulling me down with all her might and lay on top of me. Her teeth were chattering and her whole body was shaking. It was the first time in my life I'd seen my mother afraid. She told me later, while she was shielding me, she saw someone light a Zippo lighter to look for Lamb, and when they found him, he'd been shot in the head. He'd been sitting to my right and higher up. If I'd sat on the same level, I would also have been shot and killed. I only heard my mother say, "Please pray." My mother was not religious, but she said, "Pray to God and everyone else. Pray, 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 so we can survive." It was the police who had told us to stop, and the captain of the boat just jumped into the river and let the boat continue on without steering. We'd not even reached the sea, but we were still in the delta. Tuk, tuk, tuk was the sound from the boat, and ka-ka-ka-ka from the automatic AK rifles. It smelled like blood. That time, we were 90 people on board. Over half were shot, most of them children. Everybody was trampling each other. I remember I gave my back to support Lamb, who was not sitting upright. His whole brain matter and blood was all over me. I was covered in blood, so everyone thought I was heavily injured. Back on land, they brought us to the police station, and we were sitting next to a severely injured man. He couldn't talk. His mouth had been shot, but he grabbed the arm of my mother and pointed to a little girl, probably about 5 years old, nearby. It was his daughter, and he somehow managed to make it clear that if something happened to him, we should look after his daughter. He was making the signal for "help me." How is that? Like this, yeah. He was making the signal for "help me," which is the signal we make in the pagoda when we pray for help. And then he pointed to the little girl. My mother asked, "Is that your daughter?" He nodded. "Do you want me to help her?" "Yes." "Shall I say I'm your wife?" She was immediately calculating a plan that if she said she was his wife, she could visit him at the hospital and then she'd be able to escape. She didn't want to admit she was the daughter of grandfather. She was clever, my mother. So she got the name of the injured man, managed to get something to write with, and wrote down her new husband's name. The police boat towed our boat, and we saw there were several boats at the police station. It was brutally hot. We had no water and no medical help. Those that were bleeding to death, they just lay there slowly losing their lives. Lamb was also dying. Though he had been shot in the head, he was still breathing. I remember in the middle of the concrete police station square, under the scorching sun, his mother made the most awful sound I've heard in my life. And his father was shaking him, then holding him desperately close, and then shaking him again. His father finally lifted his hand, and it just dropped. It was clear to all of us that Lamb had died. The shrapnel that skimmed my chest left an open, gashing wound, which bled heavily. Combined with the blood of the other children, I looked critically injured, but no one helped us. No nurses, no doctors, nothing. I can't remember the pain as much as I remember the stinging. The heavily wounded who couldn't walk, including the man who asked that we took care of his daughter, finally went on a bus. I hope they went to hospital, but I don't know, and we never knew. My mother, who had his 5-year-old daughter, seemed to realize her plan to visit him in hospital and escaping was futile. They sorted the rest of us into 2 groups, women and children who were not injured in one of the groups, and the uninjured men in another. We were sent to different prisons. The police chief met us at the prison we were taken to. He looked like many of grandfather's friends, well-educated, well-dressed, same hairstyle. And then Mother realized she could perhaps negotiate with him. She pointed to me and said, "She's bleeding much. Is she?" He pointed to me and said, "She's bleeding much. Is she injured?" "No, she's not so injured, but a bit," and continued, "I am the daughter of Phung Van Kung." He said, "The daughter of Phung Van Kung is trying to flee Vietnam? Outrageous," and then he left. At 5 o'clock, he came back and said we could all go home. We were all surprised because we thought we were headed straight to prison, women's prison. We'd been there before, but grandfather always showed up immediately to release us. But this time it was straight home with no grandfather showing up. We hitchhiked home to the house with the poisonous snake in the mango tree and learned that grandfather had had a stroke and his health was failing. After this attempt, it took us a long time to consider another. In retrospect, I believe we had some form of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. I remember being numb and in a daze for almost a year. We'd been so close to death, and my chest wound, still very, very, very visible, and you don't try to hide it, it's right across there. And my chest wound, a reminder of this for the rest of my life. It took a while and many hospital visits for all the shrapnel to be removed, and with keloid scarring being quite prevalent amongst Asians and very marked with me, this scar has graced my chest in a very prominent way since then. It was on our 7th attempt we escaped. So they tried one more time. Every time I fled with different people. This 7th time I was with my mother and my aunt. It was my aunt's very first attempt. Her husband drove us in grandfather's Citroën Taroctia. He was very happy that my mad aunt had decided to leave Vietnam so he could have some peace in his life. She was pretty crazy, your aunt. It was always considered better to flee on a boat with a boat owner himself, as the chances of successful escapes were much higher. On this attempt, we'd not only the owner, but his whole family. Our captain had with him his wife and 3 small children, 1 fat little boy, and I forgot what his name was, called X. And the wife was pregnant, so his whole family was along. Following a procedure that was by now very familiar to me, small groups of people from different walks of life with little in common but the goal to escape Vietnam would get into position in village homes near our escape point on the Mekong River Delta, on the Mekong River. This attempt was out of Ba Ria village, not far from Vung Tau, so we're not far from there tomorrow. Ba Ria is historically quite interesting, and it's one of the towns in the south many North Vietnamese Catholics fled to after Dien Bien Phu, which we learned about in one of the lectures the other day, in 1954, when the French were crushed. So on this particular fishing boat, Aunt, Ma, and I were some of the few South Vietnamese attempting escape. Dressed as peasants to avoid standing out, on our 4th night in Ba Ria, we were told it was our time. After the sun set, with only the clothes on our back, necessary water rations for hydration, and those sweetened lemon slices as nourishment for an unknown number of days at sea, we set out again across the rice fields. We walked, crouched to hide, continued to walk, crouched to hide again for several hours, until we came as close as we could to our boat. There we hid for 2 more hours, of which every minute felt like an eternity. Close to midnight, we were given our final signal and silently ran, literally for our lives, to the tiny fishing boat that was to smuggle us out of our homeland and into an unknown future. Before we boarded, my mother prepared me for the worst fate: rape by Thai pirates. Starvation, dehydration, drowning were all preferred options to being raped by Thai pirates. So my mother, and only my mother had thought of this, provided me with 8 pairs of pajama, 8 I guess is for luck as well, right? 8 pairs of pajama bottoms with elasticated waists. I put the first dry pair on, quickly dunked in the river so they stuck to my skin, then pulled another dry pair on, dunked again, and I would repeat this until I was weighed down by 8 pairs of wet pajama bottoms. The thinking being that if we were attacked by Thai pirates, by the time they pulled off all my layers, I would have managed to jump into the sea and drown myself. On board, we were placed in the bottom of the boat where the fish are usually stored, packed like sardines in a box, or as we say in Vietnamese, like fish on a cutting board, implying being in a dangerous and almost inescapable situation in which our fate is completely in someone else's hands. Our first challenge was always to escape the river police patrols, who were the ones who caught you on the 6th escape, right? Yeah. And make it out of the river delta into international waters. Once at sea, our second challenge was avoiding the dreaded Thai pirates who were everyone's nightmare. But our constant looming challenge was the sea itself, posing the greatest threat to a boat unsuitable to carry so much human ballast, and not knowing if we would have enough food and water, as we only had provisions for a couple of days. Acutely aware of these threats, we were always waiting for our captain's next updates and commands, which were few and far between. Now you have to be silent, the guard boat is near. Now we're at the river delta crossing into the sea. Now you have to pray, we're in international waters, which was of course the command we were all waiting for. Then came the prayers, the Catholics with Ave Maria and Jesus, the Buddhists with Namo Dipada. Our little fishing boat was 3 meters by 10 meters, and we were 70 refugees. We were lying so close together that it was impossible to move. With the stench of old fish blood and human sweat, I was continually seasick and kept sucking the sugared lemons that my mother had given me. And I peed in my pants repeatedly. We all did that, and more. There was nothing else to do. I laid like this for 2 nights and 3 days. Opposite me was an older lady in her 50s, and she kept saying that the Thai pirates were coming to get us. Every time she said that, my heart jumped out of my chest, reminding me that the reason my mother always made me wear multiple layers of wet pajama bottoms was so that I'd have enough time to jump into the sea and to drown myself as a preferred fate to being raped by the dreaded Thai pirates. I imagined with horror how cold the water would be should I have to jump in, how my pathetic doggy paddle swimming skills would allow the mighty sea to swallow me in one gulp. I could almost feel the sharp teeth of the sharks in my imagination. Having made so many attempts at escape, I'd managed to develop a fantasy to mentally prepare myself to jump into the sea if pirates found us. I started thinking of the sea as a home. I did that by combining bits of operas, fairy tales, and novels that I'd been exposed to growing up with my grandfather, and convinced myself that I was really a mermaid princess, the daughter of the king of the sea, who had once disobeyed my father and broken his favorite teacup. As punishment, I had to be born a person so that I could be exposed to human suffering. And when this punishment was over, I could happily return to the sea again. So I pretended I was the princess of the sea who at long last could return home after having served my sentence as a person. These fantasies carried me into a type of sleep, and my fear became less and less. And in this half-dream, half-awake state, I dreamt I could do everything when I became a princess again. I could change Hong's house to a house of gold. Hong was the teacher you saw earlier who was quite poor. I could change Hong's house to a house of gold with diamonds on the walls that she could pick one by one to sell at the market when she needed money. I dreamt I could sit on the clouds and use them as a car so I could get to grandfather every time I missed him, and that my little brother, who had died a few years before, was a prince who would wait for me at the Palace of the Seas to give me my treats. And that I could be turned into Chow's... No, I haven't read about that, so I should not talk about that, right? I had many, many dreams as I laid there curled up in the bottom of the boat, still smelling the sea, still smelling the fish, and still smelling the humans. On our 3rd day at sea, I woke up to a lot of excited chatter. That was the boat, the very boat, by the way. And that light plank you see there, it was under that plank you were lying, right? On our 3rd day at sea, I woke up to a lot of excited chatter. Our captain had seen a big ship, and they had seen us. We assumed it had to be American. He commanded all women and children to top deck and men below to optimize our chances of human compassion from the big ship crew. I was lifted up by someone and placed between my mother and aunt and many other children and women. SOS was written on T-shirts, which we waved furiously. The big ship was huge, with 5 large orange domes as its superstructure and the letters LNG on its hull. The side waves from a vessel with dead weight of almost 700,000 tons are significant, any of which could prove fatal to our overloaded fishing boat if they hit us at the wrong angle. Your captain had formidable captaining skills, I understand. When we were close enough, a ladder was lowered and a sailor came down the ladder from the big ship. Everyone who knew any kind of English or foreign language tried to communicate with the sailor. People started to doubt that this boat was American after all. 1 or 2 suddenly said, they're Russian. This is in 82, remember, before the fall of the Soviet Union. 1 or 2 suddenly said they're Russian, thinking that LNG on the side of the boat, which of course stands for liquid natural gas or liquefied natural gas, might stand for Leningrad. Now we'll all go to prison. It was incredibly chaotic. Everybody was talking at once. My aunt, who'd studied in Berlin and spoke fluent German, said something to the sailor and seemed to be the first to manage to engage a dialogue. Everyone fell silent and let the two communicate. They come from Norway, she said. Though few knew exactly where Norway was, we did know it was not a communist country, and the sigh of relief was audible. Aunt was the first to be pulled up the ladder by a sailor, and then everyone struggled to get up. People were worried they'd not make it up, so there was a huge crush. And, well, you can see it, you can sort of see it there. And several more sailors came to help and keep the order. Some, including the mother of the fat baby, had forgotten the few personal belongings she had with her on the little fishing boat in the rush to get off, including her life savings of gold, which she'd sewn into a shirt. This gold she would never see again. My mother had already taken some time to remove my wet pajama pants, which when she heard Auntie talk German. When it was my turn to be lifted up, I was very unstable on the ladder, as I'd not eaten for 3 days. And because I'd been lying in the same position for all this time, with my layers of wet pajama chastity bottoms, I probably looked particularly undernourished, since I was very skinny and tall in Vietnamese terms. So a sailor carried me into a room with some of the other children where we were inspected with stethoscopes. I remember being terrified of losing my mother and ran as fast as I could out on deck again, with a tail of children following me to find her and the rest of the adults. When we stood on deck, we saw a huge sailor on his way back down the ladder to our fishing boat and gave it 3 short hits, and the boat sank. All of us stood and watched this happen. The Vietnamese stood at the front, and the Norwegians stood behind us. All were completely silent. When the little fishing boat sank, we turned our heads towards Vietnam. We waved, and the tears ran down all our faces. Many still had their nearest family still in Vietnam. We cried with joy for finally having reached freedom, and cried with grief for leaving our country forever. I cried because I knew I would never see my beloved grandfather again. I cried because I was already missing my everyday, and I was very much in doubt about the future. I thought of Verdi's opera Aida, which I'd listened to so many times at grandfather's house, and imagined perhaps I would be sold and become a slave. A thought that struck me when I first saw the first Norwegian sailor, the biggest man I'd seen in my life, and at the age of 12 imagined I would have to marry a big man like this in my new life. And so began my new life. From pampered granddaughter of the vice president of Vietnam to a boat refugee with nothing but the clothing on my back and the education and culture instilled in me by my grandfather, to a very proud, bunad-wearing Norwegian girl. So I think I'm going to stop reading here. There's so many things that we skipped over, and there's so much afterwards. But I just thought it might be interesting to share a little context of Chi's great-grandmother and her fleeing the imperial city of Hue, and sort of how this whole thing sort of repeated itself in a very different way, and how fortunate I am, to be here today with you, or tomorrow as we really get close to where you were rescued. We've planned being in, I'm going to start to cry. We've planned being in Vietnam together for 25 years. I should actually just add, it's thanks be to Mamsen, my grandmother and first best friend in life, that I know Chi. I was working in Russia, and I was coming to Norway to visit my grandmother every month. And every time I visited my grandmother, I would take the train. And one day I was visiting my grandmother, and my computer zipper bag had the zipper on the computer bag had broken. And on the way to the train station, there was a dry cleaning shop. And I stopped by that dry cleaning shop, and there was Chi, and we met. And I think ever since that day, my granny was my first best friend, but you certainly, I think, from that day became very much my second best friend immediately. We had nothing in common, apart from the fact that we were both in Norway, kind of not really feeling Norwegian, although my blood is, yours isn't, but both of us were sort of foreigners in our country. And we've had an amazing, amazing friendship. And finally, thanks be to your world cruise, I get to hitchhike for a couple of days, and she's on board because her husband Alistair is on board working, and it all was serendipitous and lucky, and and that was what we have to share with you today. Oh, God. Cái đến này á.
Some of the more observant among you might have noticed that I have a small walk-on part in this story. In the Viking Daily, she is described as Mrs. Alistair Miller, but it's more a case of me being Mr. Chi Miller. So just to finish, Chi and I were married in Venice in December 2016. We were supposed to have the ceremony on board ship in the Explorer's Lounge, but the Viking Sea. But the ship couldn't come into Venice because the port was blocked by thick fog. So our plan B was to stay and get married in a very beautiful but run-down palazzo on the Grand Canal. And most incredibly, Karine had done some detective work and actually tracked down Captain Svein, who was the master of the ship that rescued Chi from the South China Sea. And he was secretly invited to our wedding. And I remember that evening, Chi thought he was just another guest that she hadn't been introduced to.
So my father was going to give Chi away to Alistair, and...
But in the end, it was the captain, Captain Svein, who gave Chi away, and it was a wonderful wedding. And but before he gave away, he stood up and actually started in a sort of Norwegian accented English, started telling the story of the whole rescue. And I was in on this, but she had no idea. And I would never forget her face as slowly it dawned on her who this guy actually was. And we all had goosebumps in the room that night. It was quite moving.
And he showed up with his original captain's uniform, which he had dressed
her
in 35 years earlier.
He performed the marriage ceremony wearing the same uniform he'd been wearing when the rescue took place. And I think that's pretty much all I'd like to say. I'll put up a photo which will show you some of the... So you'll know most of the people in these pictures. There's the captain, yes, here's the captain.
Can anyone guess who the ring bearer was?
What was it?
So, Finns, exactly, Finns, yeah. So Finns, it was a very small, intimate gathering. Well, no, they're not in the rest of the pictures, but you know our film team, Bill and Brad from White Rain. Bill officiated, Brad was best man, I was best girl, is that what you call it in English? My Rod, of course, was there. Charles and Paul, resident historian, who had our resident historian program, were there. It was very much a Viking family affair.
It really was. It was fantastic. No, it was amazing. And afterwards we had a honeymoon on the ship.
And of course...
In the owner's suite, by the way. Yes. Just like to... Thanks for this.
And Rod was asking, where did she get her dress?
Yes, well, of course, being Chi, she made it. And just fine, and really, this is the end. I'm just going to say one thing because this is a great opportunity to say it. I'm sure many of you think that the only reason I get to travel the world on beautiful ships and take photographs is because I'm married to Karine's best friend. But I'd just like to point out that I was actually working for Viking before we met. Okay, thank you.
is this? Does anyone of you know the Mumson's restaurant? Yep. So this is Mumson.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
I think you stand for all the values that we like to have in us. We work hard, not as hard as you. We play hard, not as hard as you. We care a lot, not as much as you. And we all have had adversity. And I know you have had a lot of adversity too, and even from time to time it still exists. But I think the way you handle adversity is an example for all of us. And I'm sure we will think back on this many times. You're great.
Tested it this morning. It works.
Sit.
Come on, get ready, man.